let's bring you this story. Denel and Transnet are the focus of part 2 of the state capture inquiry report, which was handed to President Matamela Cyril Ramaphosa earlier this week. In the report, Acting Chief Justice Raymond Zondo says, and I quote, "Evidence establishes convincingly that state capture occurred at Transnet," close quote. Well, for many, so the question is, what now? Michael Marchant is head of investigations at Open Secrets. He's joining us now this afternoon on ENC to discuss some of the issues contained in this part of the report. Michael, good afternoon. Thank you very much for your time. Can I begin with an overriding question? In your view, what were the hits and misses, in your opinion, in your view, in this report?
Good afternoon, Dan. Look, I think that from our perspective at Open Secrets, one of the hits that we see come out strongly, and I think we saw this in the first report from the Commission as well, is that there's a very clear agenda for prosecutions. And what the Commission has done well, and if you look at Transnet, I think this is a very good example, is that the Commission has methodically gone through the individual contracts that were clearly inflated for corrupt purposes to obtain kickbacks for the Gupta family and their companies. And they've made clear who is responsible for that and who the Hawks and the National Prosecuting Authority need to prioritize from a prosecution's point of view. So people like Brian Molefe, Anuj Singh, and others are clearly identified. And I think that's a very helpful thing to have in the report. I think that from a miss perspective, one of the things that I'm very concerned that I don't see in this report is a look at the system that enabled state capture. And so I'll give you an example. The Commission points to the fact that about 72% of state capture tainted funds are linked to Transnet, over 40 billion rand. And that money was washed through a global banking system. Large banks like HSBC and others played a role in moving those funds around the world and laundering them for the Gupta enterprise. And we know that that evidence was given to the Commission, and yet we haven't seen it feature strongly enough yet. So the hope very much is that that will be in the third report, but it is a pity to see an analysis of somewhere like Transnet without that bigger picture of the kind of systemic financial, system that enabled this to occur.
Okay, now the importance of Transnet. I mean, it's a huge state-owned enterprise in the state capture story. What is it in your view?
So I think there's two things that are important from the Transnet perspective. And I think, Denel also points to this first element as well, is that both of them were actually relatively well-run SOEs until this network of people arrived. And so what they show us is not simply that these institutions were manipulated from a procurement process point of view, but that this required politicians like Lynn Brown and Malusi Gigaba to actively destroy those institutions. And often that meant attacking very qualified and ethical individuals who tried to withstand attempts at capture and corruption and remove them from boards and remove them from positions of control. And so what they show us is they show us very clearly how a very sophisticated system of state capture took place and how this was a system that took us from private companies to politicians to those put in place in state-owned entities to facilitate capture. I think that's the first thing. And then the second thing, and I've mentioned this already, but the reason that Transnet is so important is just the sheer scale of money that we're talking about. As I've said, we're talking about over 40 billion rand in procurement that is linked at Transnet that is linked to corruption. And so, first of all, it's very important to tackle in terms of just the sheer cost to the fiscus, but also in terms of attempts to recover funds that still can be recovered and to pursue attempts to pay back money wherever possible. Transnet is a very important place to start. Eskom in the third report, no doubt, will be another important element of the story, but I think Transnet is such a central part just in terms of the sheer scale of contribution.
Yeah, but let's also remind our viewers that this part 2 of the report also talks about the arms company Denel, which used to be globally respected, but people would argue today that it's now a shell of its former glorious self. Now, in terms of next steps for enforcing the recommendations, I mean, all commissions make findings, make recommendations. Those are then tabled to the president, and he can then decide how to implement them. But in terms of enforcing the recommendations as next steps, what's your view?
Well, I think that this is quite an interesting case from a Commission of Inquiry perspective. And the reason that I say that is that there are going to be a series of recommendations about structural reforms and legal changes that, as you say, those will go to the president. The president will address Parliament later this year, and there'll be a series of things that need to be put in motion. However, so many of the recommendations we've seen are very clearly directed specifically to the MPA, to the Hawks, and more broadly to law enforcement. And I think from our perspective, the essential thing is they need to act now. In fact, in many cases, they should have been undertaking these investigations already. And with a case like Transnet, one would hope that the MPA is very close to being able to institute charges and prosecutions against those implicated in state capture at Transnet. And so even before we get to the president addressing Parliament and some of those more kind of structural issues, we have to see the MPA and the Hawks in action and beginning some of these prosecutions. And that's not just important from an accountability point of view to get some of these people out of the system and in court, but I think it's also important at this point from the public perspective, simply to rebuild trust in the public that there can be steps taken towards accountability and reform. And so I think that if there's anything we take out of the second report again, it's that action by the prosecutors and the police is essential, it's urgent, and it has to happen before the final report and before the president actually addresses Parliament.
Corruption, as we know, Michael, is not a one-way street. It's a two-way or sometimes more-way streets, more than two-way streets. So you've got the private enablers as well. Some individuals have been mentioned, but what about the large private enablers? What are your thoughts about what would be missing about them in this part 2 of the report? Or do you think it's fairly covered?
I think that it's a little bit disappointing that they seem to be missing in the second report in a way that they weren't in the first report. And maybe just to use a couple of examples, in the first report, we had clear recommendations of investigation and possible prosecution of Nedbank for their involvement in interest rate swaps with airports company South Africa. And we also had very clear recommendations against the private auditors from PwC for their failure at South African Airways. Yet in the second report, although Nedbank again is mentioned, and Nedbank was a very prominent party to interest rate swaps at Transnet, that the Commission rightly points out cost Transnet millions of rands in extra fees, and that these transactions were set up purely to facilitate the extraction of fees for the Gupta network. Although we have it mentioned, we don't have a clear recommendation against Nedbank in this report, and honestly, I can't see why that's the case. And then the second element, just to repeat, I think what I might have mentioned earlier, is that there's no analysis in the second report about the money laundering network, and particularly the banks and financial institutions that enabled it. And so in the case of Transnet, the one that really jumps to mind is the global banking giant HSBC. HSBC was such a central part of laundering money linked to Transnet. And so the Zondo Commission rightly points out that Salim S's companies, registered companies in Hong Kong, like Regiments Asia and Sequester, were crucial in allowing the extraction of funds from Transnet and then the laundering of funds to the Gupta family and related businesses. But it doesn't mention that HSBC held those accounts and that there is evidence that HSBC should have been aware that something was amiss and yet continued to facilitate the money flows. And so that is absent from the second report, and it's a big gap. Now, the Commission still has time to put some of that analysis in the final report, and it's essential that it does so, because without that analysis of the kind of money laundering and the role of the private facilitators, there's a massive blind spot in our ability to understand the systems that facilitated state capture. And so we very strongly hope that, while it is missing now, will be present in the later report.
Michael Marchant, Head of Investigations at Open Secrets, thank you very much for your time and your insights.